Hello, this is Dean and welcome to today's video. A friend of mine recently presented me with a challenge that I was sure superseded anything I could ever accomplish. You see, he had accidentally run some straight gasoline through his 2-cycle Husqvarna chainsaw and the piston locked up and it scored the cylinder head. The saw is only 2 years old, although it had plenty of hours on it, and the dealership took it partially apart and they deemed the saw ruined. Fast forward to now, and here we are. Now, I'd never taken apart a chainsaw before. Well, part one of this video shows the box of parts, the screws and the bolts that I was presented with, and it takes you through the remainder of the disassembly and the cleanup. And at the end of the video, I'll show you a few of the replacement parts I ordered. So let's get after it. Well, here we are, ladies and gentlemen, a Husqvarna box of parts. When I first saw this, my initial thoughts of success on any level was there's just no way. But since the dealership stated the saw was ruined, I figured all I had to lose was my time and effort. And at some point along the way, my trepidation actually turned to excitement. I mean, what if I could really pull this off? Let's examine a few of the parts we're removing. Here you see the pull starter, and here the damaged cylinder head. This is the saw's main handle, and I'm curiously wondering why the dealership took apart both sides of the grip, including the trigger and where the parts are. And what is this? It looks like part of the carburetor. Well, let's go ahead and remove the main saw body from the box and get it onto the table out in the open. Now, I must admit I needed some incentive to continue, something small though it may be. And I found it here in cleaning up just this one part, the top cover. Strange though it may sound, my goal was to try and make the entire saw look this good, whether or not it ever runs again. To begin, my new goal means disassembly of the remainder of the saw, and I chose to start here at the flywheel. I sprayed the flywheel nut with some penetrating oil and let it sit. Next, I loaded a 13mm socket onto my impact wrench, and I loosened the nut counterclockwise, using the slip joint pliers to hold, not squeeze, the flywheel fins. I found the best way to remove the flywheel is to rethread the nut and screw it down 1 or 2 turns from the bottom. While pulling from the back side, give the flywheel nut several light taps with a hammer or a rubber mallet. Once the flywheel is loose, remove the nut and the flywheel from the tapered side of the crankshaft. Let's take a closer look at that flywheel. If we zoom into the center hole, you'll see the so-called flywheel key. Now, this key fits into the slot or the keyway on the crankshaft. This key is a safety measure meant to shear off rather than damage the crankshaft in cases where such an event takes place. Now cleaned, we can observe the magnets on the flywheel, which spin past the ignition coil, causing a spark to occur at the spark plug. Okay, so now what? Well, let's flip the saw over and turn our attention to trying to remove the clutch. Not ever having done this before on a chainsaw, I began by doing the wrong thing. And I'm showing you this part to let you know it wasn't all success all the time. I didn't need to remove these clutch springs, as this had nothing to do with the clutch removal. And I ended up later having to put them back on. For the moment, we'll turn our attention to removing the chain brake handle. Take a 4mm Allen wrench or socket and remove this bolt on either side. This bolt has a unique profile. The spring action of the chain brake handle occurs because of this piece, of which we'll take a closer look. Even though this spring needed removing, the way I did it here cost me several minutes of searching after it flew out of the housing across the basement floor. Now, once I've found it, I can show you how the flat side of this piece is supposed to go underneath the chain brake handle and not on top like this. Now, had I been more careful during removal, I would have seen that. As it is, now I'll have to use logic to figure out which direction it goes. goes in like this instead. Yep, there you go. Okay, let's flip this saw over. And we want to tackle the same chain brake handle bolt on the other side. There's no springs on this side. So now I'm going to turn the saw around once again as we remove the handle, since the other side seems to be more complex in terms of how the handle fits inside the case. I'll show you a closer view of what we're doing. This male portion I'm pointing to fits inside the female portion of the case. Now onto the ignition coil. This thing is coated so deeply in grime I can't even find all the bolts. But what I do see is this blue wire I need to remove, so let's carefully take care of that. Aha, now I can see at least one 4mm bolt. As we remove that bolt, we see what looks like a ground wire attached to it. So let's go ahead and pick that up. Now both the blue wire and the black wires feed to what looks like the kill switch in red here on the side of this carburetor part. So I'm going to remove that assembly through this hole in the case. What's next? Well, here's some low-hanging fruit. I can easily flip the saw around and remove the primer bulb. The primer bulb just pumps some fuel into the carburetor to assist with starting. So what I'm going to do is just pinch these ears together and remove the primer bulb. What I found here was a bit disturbing. Although we can see the clear hose attached to the center of the primer bulb, shown also on the bulb is a second hose attachment. We'll have to figure out what goes there later. Here on the fuel tank side, one of the easier things we can do is unscrew the gas cap and totally remove it by carefully compressing and removing this Y-shaped plastic stop. Once removed, take some long thin pinchers and grasp and remove the fuel line filter. We're going to twist and remove this filter from the line. Because the saw was partially disassembled, we didn't know it at the time, but this black rubber piece acts as a tunnel from the outside of the saw to the adjustment screws on the carburetor. Once reassembled, we want to take note of the way it's removed. It took a while to find it, but we uncovered a second ignition coil bolt. Again, this is just 4mm. Now freed, the coil can easily be removed, revealing this copper-colored grounding strap underneath. This strap can simply be lifted out. I'm going to show you this part and then temporarily stick it back in place to make sure I remember the orientation and where it goes. It's important to note that when the cylinder head was removed at the dealership, the bolt that goes up through this grounding strap on one end was removed as well. It was only after I shed some light on this flywheel shroud that I found this 4mm bolt, because it was covered in oil and grime. Take note that this bolt is also a different length than the others. Another reminder of how difficult reassembly is going to be with bolts in the box that I didn't personally remove or catalog. As we pick up the shroud, note a small male appendage which fits into the female hole in the case. This is going to be important on reassembly. Now I'll remove the two 4mm bolts holding on the dog or the bucking spike and keep these bolts with it for cleaning and painting. Take note of the orientation of the bucking spike, and let's move on to the piston removal. On either side of the piston wrist pin is a clip called a circlip. This clip fits into a small groove on either end of the piston to hold in the wrist pin. To remove the circlip, grasp it by the short bent end and twist and pull outward counterclockwise. Now let's see how it works on the other side. In this close-up, you can see the groove into which the circlip fits. Now I'm going to take this large socket and place it underneath the piston to catch the wrist pin. And then use a hammer and this smaller socket, just slightly smaller than the wrist pin, to tap out the pin. Watch carefully. Because the piston fell off after this step, I'm going to show it to you in slow motion. And what you're going to see is the piston come off, and the wrist pin and the roller needle bearings, they all fall into this large catch socket. Right there. Upon reassembly, the needle bearings will go back into the connecting rod like this. And the wrist pin fits inside the needle bearings like this. Because the chainsaw dealership left this saw in such disarray, to get the clutch off, I'll have to gingerly grab the crankshaft with these slip joint pliers. After several failed attempts, I went ahead and ordered this clutch removal tool for the Husqvarna, and I'll make the link available to you. It fits around the clutch like this, and it requires a 19mm or a 3/4 inch socket. So I grabbed onto and held the crankshaft in place with my pliers while using my impact wrench in a counterclockwise direction. Now, I'd spent more time than I like to remember trying to get this clutch off using various techniques, and here it's off in 2 seconds. Is your time worth more than a $6 tool? Mine is. Remove the clutch drum, exposing the needle bearing and the black pinion gear. Note how the notches in the drum collar fit over the notches in the black pinion gear. Remove the clutch and needle bearing. Unscrew and remove the black pinion gear. The fact that there is nothing to provide resistance underneath makes this more difficult than it should be. Now, as you can see, the pinion gear has threads, and they engage with the threads in the mechanical oil pump. Now that the crankshaft is unencumbered, we remove it by sitting the saw on its bottom, and then we rotate the counterbalance weights in a position that will allow for crankshaft removal, as demonstrated here. Anytime you remove the cylinder, you want to replace these cylinder or base seals. Again, I'll provide this link. For now, we're just going to remove the old ones. This metal plate is an integral part of the chain oiler pump mechanism. It must be removed and cleaned. It's held down by one Phillips screw. And I found out it's very important this plate not be bent, but at this juncture, who can tell? Regular viewers know I like to place screws back in their original locations for safekeeping and cataloging. Here we see the oil pump feeder tube. This tube carries the oil from the pump to the top of the chain. Now this is just the compression fit. It's held down by that metal plate we just removed. Use a 4mm wrench or socket to remove this oil pump bolt. As we remove the pump, you can see the adjustment screw appear that is hidden at the bottom inside the case. Once again, we replace the bolt. Well, for now, that completes the disassembly of the case parts. As we rotate the case, we can see the oil pump hose that feeds oil from the oil tank to the oil pump and subsequently to the chain. For now, we're just going to leave this in place. This alloy base remains in the case. Let's take a quick look at the crankshaft. We're going to remove these crankshaft seals as they'll need to be replaced anytime the engine is apart. They're the same on both ends of the crankshaft. Also note there's one blunt and one tapered end to the crankshaft as shown earlier. A quick once around the bearings shows them to be in good shape. They roll freely, they're tightly mounted, nothing to replace here. But should they need to be replaced, they'll need to be pressed off. We went ahead and cleaned and painted the muffler and shield, and it looks much better. A closer look at the cylinder reveals some additional parts to remove. One such part is this decompression valve. It aids in starting the chainsaw and will need to be transferred to the new cylinder we ordered. Remove it as shown and set it aside. Lastly, we turn to the removal of this rubber manifold. Removal includes loosening 3 4mm bolts. If we carefully fold over the top, you can see one bolt here. The first bolt can be accessed by placing your Allen wrench between the two manifold openings and turning counterclockwise. Remove all 3 bolts in this manner. Next, remove the impulse line from the side of the cylinder. And now the entire manifold assembly may be removed. Note that this manifold sits inside a collar with the impulse line feeding through this hole right there. At the time of this filming, I didn't yet know what this springed protrusion was on the cylinder. Later I found it to be one of the handle attachment points that's shock mounted. Regardless, it must be removed to attach it to the new cylinder. So using a long Allen wrench, we loosen and remove this part as shown. And this concludes the disassembly. Now I would estimate the cleanup of these parts took 2 hours. Here's the clean, reassembled trigger, of which we'll provide more detail in part 2. And here's a preview of the new cylinder. The new piston, and to the left of it, the new ring. Shown here are the 2 new cylinder seals. And here's the cleanly and freshly painted bucking spike or dog. Remember how we started? Now everything is nice and clean. But the challenge doesn't end at clean. My charge was not to take the saw parts and clean them, it was to try and fix the original issue after all, in addition to trying to reassemble the saw and get it running again. I know at the time of this filming I was cautiously optimistic, and now, seeing the clean saw parts like this, somewhat excited about the challenge. My shock at the looks of the original box of parts is now a distant memory. As far as the new parts I ordered and the total cost of the repair, I'll post it all for you in part 2 along with the links for ordering the parts. But if you're going to try and tackle this, you have to know there's a cost associated with your time related to what you've seen in disassembly and cleaning here. So stick around for part 2 to see if I can pull this off, and thanks for watching. I'd like to thank you today for watching part 1 of today's video. I'd like to invite you to stick around and watch part 2 as well.